Professor Steve Mann from the University of Warwick, who will be speaking about dialogic reflection. Thank you so much for joining us, and feel free to share your screen.
First of all, thanks very much to the Institute, in particular Sadi and Paulius and the rest of the team. It seems such a privilege to be here in Paris and to have a month to be able to write. And it's been great listening to Eleanor, David, Jorge, Tina, and Jeff. And um, I can hear some resonances in their work, and I've been reflecting on as I've listened. And I think it's interesting that the whole raison d'etre of this institute is to provide space and encourage dialogue. Um, I'm going to be talking about dialogic reflection, which essentially is collaborative. It's a mediated form of talk inquiry. The emphasis is often on structured conversation, although there's a whole question about what we mean by structure, to examine experience, ideas, assumptions. And the idea, I think, is that we transcend the individual by looking at dynamic interaction, looking at multiple perspectives. So this afternoon, I'd just like to explain some starting points and a health warning. I feel like I'm quite early on in this process of what I'm going to be writing about this September. But I also want to offer a couple of ways in which I could work with fellow IEA residents if they're interested, and maybe outline a few steps in revisiting dialogic reflection and how I plan to do that. I've been looking online and looking at some documents from the Institute. And as I say, its mission, its raison d'etre is to provide and support original, often speculative thinking. I'm very much interested in this kind of idea of emergent speculative, not quite formed, inchoate, confused, complex thinking. Also to promote discussions which encourage reflection. So that's an explicit part of documents that you can find on the website. And we've heard, particularly yesterday, Sadi and Paulius talking about how they sometimes deliberately create the conditions to allow researchers to talk in dialogic ways, to connect, extend, and discover ideas. And I'm particularly interested in what was talked about as a reverse seminar. So I'd be quite interested in attending one of those and looking at how that impacts on the kind of interaction that happens. So some starting points for me, I'd like to say a little bit about cooperative development, which is where I first started getting interested in how talk can provide a context for more reflective kinds of talk. A little bit about reflection and reflexivity, and then perhaps talking about some work that I've done with Professor Steve Walsh at Newcastle, trying to design more collaborative data-led reflection with appropriate tools, particularly looking at technology, in order to arrive at a more dialogic reflection. And I've been reading some work, neonatal studies, and I wanted to share some very initial ideas that I have about interaction engine from a couple of papers that I've read. In terms of where these ideas come from, in this book that I wrote with Steve Walsh, there's a chapter 8, about dialogic reflection. And I felt that I was touching the surface, that there was a lot more to say, and I felt that I wanted to revisit dialogic reflection and see if there was something more data-led and more substantial to say about it. So I guess that's the origin of the idea that the Institute has generously supported. But also, I've explored reflexivity in interview processes with qualitative research, and tried to find evidence of the ways in which interviewers reflect on their identity and on their methodology and how that impacts on the research. So those are two kind of core elements of my work, which I think feed into this current interest. But stepping back in time, when I did my PhD, it was on something called cooperative development. And this was, let me just go back there. My supervisor was someone called Julian Edge, who was a mentor to me in many ways. And he developed a model of talking called cooperative development, which was very heavily based on um, Carl Rogers' ideas, like Rogerian understanding. So maybe changing talk so that it's less like what we might call normal talk or normal conversation or normal debate. And it has quite a lot of connection with what Eleanor was talking about, a listening and the power of listening. And often we get focused much more on speaking than how do we listen? How can we be good listeners? So cooperative development is trying to design talk so that it's more listening based. And like Carl Rogers' work, it's based on the values of respect, empathy, and sincerity. Julian's work had developed particular linguistic moves, particularly reflecting and focusing. I'm not going to talk about these in detail today, but just to say that there are different moves that you can practice as listeners in order to support the emerging ideas of a speaker. Um, the work that I've done previously with Steve Walsh and others, Tom Farrell in Canada, is to challenge the semiotics of reflection, that it's an individual practice. And when we think about the way that reflection is often viewed, it is as an individual pursuit. You can only really do it at the seaside or somewhere beautiful on your own. You need to support your head with your hand and have this kind of perfect condition for individual thought. And the semiotics of this go back a long way. And we can, another Parisian, Rodin, the sculpture, the thinker. Um, and I was reading about this last night. I didn't know that Rodin was heavily influenced by Charles Baudelaire, who, as we know, was writing on the third floor of this building, which is kind of daunting to me that I'm also writing here, but also inspiring because Rodin was very influenced by Baudelaire, particularly with The Thinker and also The Kiss. And this idea that physical form can be a vehicle for exploring um, internal emotional states. But my purpose in sharing this today is just to reiterate the fact that reflection is often seen as an individual, maybe written, um, but certainly something that's best achieved on your own. And the dark side of this kind of semiotics is Narcissus, who hasn't done reflective practice any favors because it's often seen as something in America you might say navel gazing, where it's introspective and kind of so what. So reflective practice has kind of suffered from this semiotics. And in our world of education, where education is often a process where we're giving answers to questions that students have not asked, they're not interested in. A lot of education is like that. And classrooms are dominated by teacher talk. Often our experience of education is monologic rather than dialogic. And a lot of the work that I've done with PhD students and others is to use action research, design-based education research to try and change the norms of interaction, often not radically, just tweaking or changing the way that pre-service teacher education is designed, or seminars in CPD, professional talk, are designed. And this involves sometimes disrupting or intervening and changing the way that we do things somewhat. And we found that the way that we mediate reflection with scaffolding in a kind of Vygotskian sense, finding appropriate tools, using the technology that's available, and even now AI in order to help to structure the experience of reflection. And some of my PhDs, I'm still working with a lot of PhD students who are using video tools such as Iris Connect or VO, e-portfolios, podcasting, mentoring or coaching projects where they're trying to embed reflective practice and work towards more dialogic reflection. And whether I guess to some extent there may be some connections with the kind of work that David's talking in that it doesn't really matter whether you're a teacher or a medical practitioner. The face-to-face professional development talk that we're engaged in is obviously a powerful mechanism, but sometimes misunderstood, or sometimes the practitioners haven't thought enough about the kinds of interaction that they're having and what the consequences and perhaps unintended consequences are. And one of the things that I've been dabbling in this week, and this is a literature that probably Eleanor knows a lot better than I do, because my work hasn't been with neonatal and with children. So I'm kind of with some trepidation now going into this area, but with the health warning that I'm a relative newbie. So I've come across a couple of papers from Stephen Levinson looking at evidence of infant interaction with caregivers. And it's interesting that within days of birth, these neonates interact with their caregivers, that there is clearly interaction going on, and that you can see it in evidence of turn taking and gaze, that there are the rudimentary first steps of turn taking and sequence organization. And Levinson argues that within us, then, there are these emotional, informational, and interactional dimensions that are associated with supportive relationships. And I've been thinking about the Institute and how you're creating the context and the environment for this kind of social interaction. But his work, the IE, the interactional engine, proposes that we have this special capacity for interaction with different cognitive skills, joint attention, things like empathy, common ground. Um, and so if these are innate aspects of the way that we experience life as a starting point, then for me, it's worth me looking back at some of the studies that have been done, looking at evidence of turn taking with 2 to 4 year olds. Not that I will necessarily change my topic to start looking at neonates, but I'm trying to understand how we have a fundamental preference or comfort with empathy and listening. Um, and I'm reading a paper by Hamilton and others talking about how studying face-to-face interaction, we can see that behavior and brain processes and cognition operate differently when people are in interaction with another person. I read a paper the other day, maybe talk to Eleanor about it. She probably will know more about it, how with infants, the directed listening, when they're listening and it's directed towards them, their brain patterns are very different from when they are listening more peripherally, when there's some talk going on which isn't directed to them. So I'm interested in things like the timing and rhythm of natural interaction. And I'm also, why am I looking at this? I'm trying to think about some of the complaints that are made about changing talk as making it artificial. And people talk sometimes about cooperative development or reflective practice. Well, it's all very well, but that's not what we do in real life. But if real life and the way that we start our life is in these particular ways which we can demonstrate with neonates, then I think there's some interest here. Looking at the multimodal nature of human communication. Again, studies with brains show that when messages are supported by multimodal elements, then the brain takes in more information than when it's just verbal exchange. So these are some things, sequential contingencies, that's another area that arises out of the interactional engine that I'd like to try and connect to dialogic reflection. I've also been interested for some time in multimodality, particularly with some of the work my students are doing with video and podcasting um, and e-portfolios in trying to create and engage teachers with more multimodal ways of meaning making. And again, there's a couple of papers that I've read this week which are interesting on that score. Returning to the Institute's annual report last year, one of the quotes from one of the fellows said, "It was very enriching to discuss informally over lunch and drinks too. These conversations both helped me to see my own project from a non-specialist perspective and to get a sense of the important developments in other fields." So I'm kind of feeling that myself this week. And then another positive comment, thanks to the interaction at IAS, the initial direction of my research evolved significantly from its inception. It led me to examine issues of power, societal structures, and their impact on achieving sustainability goals. This shift in focus, I was really struck by how somebody's initial research was actually shaped and changed by the kinds of interactions they had here. And I was thinking, perhaps this is a little bit arrogant, so tell me if it is, that maybe there are some next steps for the Institute in that clearly the Institute is creating the necessary conditions, but is there space for understanding more about the kinds of interaction and dialogic reflection that happen here? Could the Institute position dialogic reflection as one of its new research methods? A lot of research bodies put a lot of emphasis on written research outputs, but do we systematically document and analyze some of these collaborative processes? So I think that's something I'd quite like to talk to Sadi and other people, Paulius, about whether there is any studies of some of the reflection and some of the interaction that's happened here. Less arrogantly, returning to me, I want to review some of the data sets that I've built up, mine and with students, to look at instances of dialogic reflection, account for some of the variety, things, the interpersonal, but also the intrapersonal, multimodal, and how these things interact. I'm interested in looking again at some of the linguistic features of connection making, resonances, the way people use metaphor, narratives, anecdotes, the kind of hedging and speculation, differentiation, signaling of grey areas of third spaces, breakthrough moments, light bulb moments. These are some of the things that I'd quite like to look for linguistic evidence of. And then maybe look at some areas that I haven't looked at before, like neonatal studies, to try and establish and further my understanding, at least, of how these are fundamental social and interactive aspects of the way that we talk to each other. So looking again at the interactional, the interpersonal, looking at multimodal, intertextual nature of dialogic reflection. Some of my work previously has been influenced by Bakhtin, the idea of heteroglossia, the kind of internalized voices and concepts and frameworks which we carry around and articulate and revisit in talk, which we often carry in tension or somewhat in debate. I'm quite interested in the way that our minds work centrifugally and centripetally, that sometimes we have a desire to focus in and narrow our focus, and sometimes we want to broaden out and try and see, you know, what else is out there on the horizon. So that's a kind of taste of what I hope to be looking at in the next month. And I'd just like to renew my offer in that there's a couple of areas that if anyone was interested in having a chat or working more concretely with me on, if somebody wanted or a group wanted to have a go at cooperative development and changing the kinds of talk that we have at our disposal, perhaps with a pair or a small group or one of the writing groups that's being established. That's a genuine offer. And also, as I said before, I've written a book on reflexivity in interviews. So if anybody's interested in exploring reflexive dimensions of their interviewing work, focus groups or one-to-one interviews, I'd be happy to have a chat or work more in a structured way on those. So that's all. If you've made it to the end of those 5 talks, congratulations. And I welcome any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yes, it's been long today. Great. Any questions? Yes, Sadie.
Well, thank you so much. And of course, Steve, I'll take your offer to help us to improve the way we work here. That's part of our endeavor. We try to be a platform for collective intelligence between the fellows and ourselves, and that all the people on the platform, where we try to create what we call formats, right? The notion of investment in form by Boltanski no, sorry, of Aimard Duvernay and Thévenot, and this is our job here, is to find new ways of thinking. So if you can help us doing this, for example, we've been trying to elaborate what is the reverse seminar, but we have other things that we love to learn and I like your approach. I'm a fan of the Edgar Schein's approach to humble inquiry, and today there was a lot of talks about linguistics, and this I think what you say shines very well with what Eleanor told us about listening and the importance of the fact that dialogue is not just one way but to exchange, and so just to give you food for thought, because you were talking about interaction, just one personal experience. So the technical system I'm using is micro camera in people's glasses, very very small, so we get a first person perspective of what they do, and then when they see the tape, we discuss with them, and they remember very well their intentions. But one thing we did was having several people wear the cameras and discussing normally. And so one fascinating thing we had when we were looking at the cameras, the recording simultaneously, is that suppose this is person A, right? The eyes, right? And this is person B, and this is what happens when they're solving a problem. They're looking at the problem, the device like this, and synchronously, from time to time, as they talk, they look at each other and they have eye contact. And
Mm,
then it's like this, right?
mm,
It's like they're talking, they're focusing on the problem. And then every now and then, simultaneously, we don't know how this happens. It's like they check, are we on the same page, right?
mm,
And that's
mm,
what happens. So there is no such thing as a dialogue. It's the psychosocial triangle of my master Moscovici. It's this ego, alter, and the object, and the capacity of listening and focusing also on what we're talking about. And the other thing there is I think what makes it fruitful is it's always about something, and the more we focus about the thing, the easier we can listen, because we're freed of the relationship between people, and suddenly we focus on what's the matter.
mm,
I found it really interesting. Just like when you have these annual, reviews with your staff or whatever, it's always say, don't focus on the person, focus on the results. And it's quite important to uh, free us in relationships of the weight of the interpersonal. That's one of the things that you use, right? So you can actually focus on the object rather than on the relation.
mm, mm,
And maybe that's one of the secrets of what happens at this institute, is that all the people here belong to different organizations, different disciplines. And so there's no pecking order. there's no competition, there's no fight on resources, and we can have free discussions because this doesn't matter for the relationships or that we have together in terms of institutions.
Mm.
Um, so we really look forward to your help for making this place better.
Yeah, thanks. I think I was not necessarily. I certainly don't want it to sound critical. Like I've got a better way of doing things. It was more a case of documenting some of the interesting processes that are already happening, and whether any researchers have actually looked at some of the interaction that's happening in this space. It just seemed to me to be really interesting. But I hear. Eleanor was talking about your work the other day, and I'd like to follow up some of your work on the use of cameras and what that tells us about synchronicity of gaze, and maybe connected to some work that I've done on how linguistically people are often checking alignment and whether are we on the same page, right? We're okay. We get each other.
We
Thanks very much.
and we'd love that. And Tina was there last year, and she observed the whole thing from as a fellow. And so she is the one who is your best participant for that.
Great. Yes, and Eleanor next.
Well, thank you, Steve. We've had a lot of talks like on the RER and walking down the street, getting semi-lost and things like that. But this really, I think, brought us together. Um, and just to say that I taught for over 2 decades at UCLA, which is the land of co-construction.
Mm.
Come in and say like the handshake, like how do you, I mean, the handshake cannot be with one person, it's with two people, but the same thing is with meaning making. And um, so there's, okay, I'm sure that you know about this person, but Charles Goodwin is the person on this topic. And he died a few years ago. But the book that came out just before his death is called Cooperation. It's CO hyphen capital operation, and it really it goes from almost like a breath, or how that kind of dialogic meaning making is within a single utterance. And that, like, when somebody is producing some thought in verbal, trying to verbalize that thought, that it's not like it has like the old models of a kind of speaker and a hearer and an arrow or a double-edged arrow, that the thought is coming out as you're speaking. So it's like thinking while speaking. Dan Slobin, the developmental psychologist, also wrote about that in human development. It's so fascinating, to see that process. And we all called him Chuck. Chuck Goodwin looked at that like microsecond by microsecond as it's going out, and the eye gaze, where the eye gaze is going, and how, depending upon who the recipient of the talk is, and it could switch in mid utterance, that these things get sort of botched and filled out, and it's not a pretty sentence. It could have all these cutoffs and little micro pauses and so on. But we can talk about that later. But there are two people who are like down the street from this building, who are French. One is a French linguist, and one is, I would guess, a French psychologist. And they are really right up your alley. One is Aaliyah Morgenstern, who's at Paris 3 and just lives around the corner. And another one is Maya Gratier. And Maya Gratier has looked at neonates or very tiny infants and looked at the interactions between mothers and these tiny infants. And she's in a department of like musicology or something like that, because it's very much like music. And she also she's half Indian, and she also looked in India and looked at immigrants to the United States and in India, and how there was this incredible kind of coordination. But anyway, there are two great intellects who work on that the communication, including the body, especially the body. Yeah. Thank you.
Great, that's really helpful. Thanks very much, Eleanor. I'll follow up with you on that.
Mhm.
Great. Any other questions? Okay. If not, thank you so much, Steve and